Hi everyone, welcome to our 45th video session. Today we are going to be speaking to Vikramjeet Sharma on hunger and food security. But before we get started, let's introduce what we do at Impaction and video sessions, and also ask people to introduce themselves in 2 sentences or less. So ultimately, Impaction's purpose is to lower the barrier to entry in social impact. We're trying to make it easier for people in our community to make a difference in their local communities. The purpose of video sessions is ultimately to bring people from around the world and talk about social impact issues, interview social entrepreneurs in the space, and also to solve challenges for real world social entrepreneurs. So we're ultimately bringing the community together face to face every other Sunday. During COVID, we've made these video sessions a lot more frequent, so they're every Sunday because it seems like people are genuinely interested in social impact. So let's just go around and introduce ourselves in 2 sentences or less. I'm Shivani. I'm one of the co-founders of Impaction, and I'm based here in Chicago, Illinois. Dan, would you want to go next?
Yeah, hi, I'm Dan Heiniger, based here in Chicago. I'm with Impaction as the Community Engagement and Outreach Coordinator.
Awesome, thank you. Bethany, do you want to go?
Sure, I'm Bethany. I'm based in DC and I currently work in budget analysis for the government, but I'm particularly interested in the intersection between economic development and gender development.
Awesome, thank you. Scott?
Hey everybody, my name is Scott. I'm currently in Toronto. I'm one of the founders of OVO Solar Technologies, and we've developed a solar-powered egg incubator to help farmers in Africa raise more chickens, earn more money, and ultimately become more food secure is the goal.
Awesome. And Scott was one of our social innovation competition semifinalists, so welcome. Emily, do you want to go?
Hi, I'm Emily Allen. I'm with Because International. I'm the International Programs Manager, and I'm from Nampa, Idaho.
Awesome. Thank you, Emily, for joining. Okay, so I'm going to introduce our speaker for today. So we'll be learning today about food security and how to address the hunger crisis in Sub-Saharan Africa from Vikramjeet Sharma. Vikramjeet leads food and agriculture focused initiatives at TechnoServe, a US-based global nonprofit in India and Sub-Saharan Africa. In his career spanning almost a decade, he has advised C-level clients at the World Bank, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and more in 10 plus states in India and 7 countries in Sub-Saharan Africa. Prior to TechnoServe, he worked with the national government in India as Prime Minister's Fellow, being among the top 2% out of 100,000 candidates selected by the government of India for a prestigious public leadership program. In his role, he led the implementation of large-scale social security programs of the government focused on food security, financial inclusion, and public health. Vikramjeet, thank you so much for being our presenter for today. I'm just going to let you take it away.
Thanks a lot, Shivani, and thank you everyone for joining in, especially on a Sunday. Really appreciate. So I've prepared a short presentation. It's just 10 slides. I am on your lunch on a Sunday, so I'll keep it short. Yeah, as you know, today's topic is food security and hunger. Here is the overall agenda that we're going to discuss about. I'll quickly talk you guys through what food security is, what's actually the definition of food security, what are different types of food insecurity, how the hunger is distributed all over the world. So where are the most hungry people in the world, food deprived people in the world? What are the top 3 drivers behind hunger and food deprivation? And then I'm gonna wrap it up with our work that we are doing in Sub-Saharan Africa. And I hopefully would have some time left by the end of the presentation if you guys have any questions. Usually, or rather popularly, when we speak about food security, a lot of people quite often relate it to hunger. While that's not completely incorrect, but it's not the most accurate representation or understanding of food security. So this is the definition which the Food and Agriculture Organization under the UN uses to define food security. And it says that food security exists when all people at all times have physical and economic access to sufficient and nutritious food that meets their dietary needs and food preferences for an active and healthy life. By its very nature, food security is multidimensional in nature. And as you can see, there are four key dimensions that define food security. Starting from the left, the number one dimension is availability. And this is basically from the supply side of food security. So it talks about, are we producing enough food? Do we have enough stocks of food? And how much we export, how much we import. What's fascinating is that currently the world produces enough food to feed 10 billion people, and we are only 7.6 billion. Well, I should not say only, but we are 7.6 billion people. So we produce enough actually to feed almost 1.5x of the current world population. So what's most paradoxical or ironical is that we still have 800 million people in the world who do not have access to food. And we'll probably delve into the reasons later. But the second dimension of food security is people having the physical and the economic access to food. So if there is enough food being produced, do they have access, the physical access to the food, and do they have enough purchasing power, or do they have enough money to buy that food? So that's the second dimension of food security. The third dimension, which is often neglected, or it usually comes as a surprise to a lot of people, is the food quality. So there are many countries in the world which are producing enough food for their population, but they are still categorized under food insecure nations because they are not producing a wholesome meal for people. So they are only producing a very limited range of food material. Or in simple words, their food basket is not very diverse. So when I was working in Malawi, is one of the top 10 poorest countries in the world. Malawi got independence in 1970, and because it was a poor country and it did not have enough foreign reserves, what Malawi did was it started producing a lot of maize and a lot of tobacco. Tobacco because it wanted to sell tobacco so that it can get a lot of foreign reserves, a lot of foreign currency, and a lot of maize because they wanted to feed their people. And in the last 30 years, Malawi has not actually diversified its food basket, so they're still producing a lot of maize, but they're not producing enough fruits or vegetables or meat or fish. So that's what I mean by food quality. So their population is food insecure because the diet they get is not very diverse or deprived of what we call micronutrients, that's vitamins and minerals. And the fourth dimension of food security is stability. So in the definition, you see it's mentioned all people at all times. So whether a country can feed its people with the right quality of food and provide the access, both physical and economic access to food, but can it provide it for the entire year and for years and years to come? That's what it means by stability. So even if the country meets the first three criteria, but it keeps falling on the fourth one, it would still be categorized as food insecure. So all four dimensions are actually necessary. So even if a country lacks on any one of these four dimensions, it will be categorized as food insecure. The reason I have highlighted these two at the center, access and utilization, because I'll tie it later to the work we are doing. What's important to note here is that any kind of project or any kind of work that's been done in the space of food security has to do with one of these four dimensions. So there are a lot of organizations, let's say Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, they are working a lot on the supply side. So they are helping a lot of smallholder farmers to increase their production, right? So they are increasing the production of food. Similarly, there are a lot of microfinance banks who are working on access side of food security because they're providing micro loans to poor people so that they can have enough money in their wallet so that they can go and buy food. A lot of organizations are innovating with food stamps, give access to food. Similarly, a lot of organizations are working in food quality and similarly in stability. But stability is primarily the responsibility of the nation states and their national governments to ensure their population is fed all the time, right? So that's the very basic definition of food security. All right, so what's the nature of food insecurity, right? It primarily depends on two factors, the duration and the severity, right? So by duration, I mean, it's self-explanatory, but there are three kinds of food insecurity based on the duration for which it lasts. So there is long-term or persistent food insecurity, which we call the chronic food insecurity. So countries like South Sudan or Malawi, for that matter, or Yemen, lot of conflict-ridden countries which are under perpetual displacement of population or conflict, they suffer from chronic insecurity. The second kind of food insecurity is transitory, so it's short-term and temporary. When I was in Sub-Saharan Africa in the last 2 months, in January and February, Malawi and Botswana, they were going through transitory food security because of COVID-19, because everything came to standstill. So people were not able to access the right quantity of food they needed. And the third one is the seasonal food insecurity, which is sort of cyclical in nature. So any state in the states which gets hit by cyclone, or any state in India gets hit by floods, they face a temporary food insecurity, which is called the seasonal food insecurity. The second dimension of food insecurity is severity, right? So, as per the World Food Program and FAO, they define a basic threshold, the average consumption of kilocalories that a person needs to survive, and it's 2100 kilocalories per day. So, on an average, if a country's population is not able to get 2100 kilocalories per day, it's the country is categorized under different levels. So there are broadly four levels. Some people choose to use five factors as well, but this is broadly the more agreed upon four factors. So any country which has its population consuming more than 2100 or equal to 2100 kilocalories of food per day is considered food secure, and then as the level goes down, the severity increases and the countries are categorized accordingly. So that's how food insecurity is defined based on duration and the severity. All right, so let's see, where are these hungry people, or who are hungry? So this actually shows you on the global level where are all the how the hunger is distributed, right? So there are around 821 million people. That's almost one people in every nine people who goes to bed hungry each night. There are around five of those 820 million people. Around 500 million people are in Asia and the Pacific. Around 250 million people in Sub-Saharan Africa, and around 100 million people in Latin America and the Caribbean. The reason I have highlighted the Sub-Saharan Africa is because I'm going to tie it again to the work we are doing in Sub-Saharan Africa. What a lot of people find confusing or confounding is that, as I mentioned earlier, when we talk about food security, we only immediately relate it to hunger. But as I said, it's not the most accurate understanding of food security. And it may come to you as a surprise, but a lot of states in the United States of America are food insecure. But that's a different kind of food insecurity. So on one extreme of food insecurity is hunger. On the other extreme of food insecurity is obesity, right? That is related to not having the right kind of diet, right? Remember I mentioned food quality as one of the dimensions, having a balanced or diverse diet. There are a lot of states in America which are food insecure because people are not having a very rich, diverse, or balanced diet there. This is just another depiction of hunger at global level. The total 7.6 billion people, or 7,633 million people. You see how many have severe food insecurity, how many have moderate food insecurity of the total population. And if you see the second last circle from the right, or the second circle from the right, America is there, and you see a small dot there. That's what I was talking about. A lot of people who suffer from obesity, and of course, Asia takes the largest chunk of food insecure people. But the causes of food insecurity across these regions are very different. That's the point I'm trying to drive here. So in Asia and Africa, food insecurity is driven by hunger and access and purchasing power parity, while in more developed nations, it is being driven by not having the right kind of diet or balanced diet, which leads to obesity, right? So that's how hunger is depicted or is spread across the world. Let's look into the top 3 reasons why food insecurity exists, or why nations go food insecure. There are many other reasons, but the first one is obvious. Climate change is contributing a lot to food insecurity. In the last 100 years, temperature has gone up by 1 degree. Now, this seems trivial at its face value, but it has a massive implication when it comes to agriculture, because it is leading to more drought and famines. It is leading to frequent crop failure because a lot of crops which are accustomed to a specific temperature range, their temperature range has gone out of the window now, and they are not able to cope up. So either we need more genetic engineering, or the crops need to evolve on their own to become attuned to the new temperature ranges. But currently, it is leading to a lot of crop failure. Uh, it has also led to catastrophic decline in groundwater levels. Just to give you an example, in India, for example, in the last 10 years, only in last 10 years, our groundwater tables have gone down by 65%. Even last year, there was one state in our country which had completely gone out of. Crop in the world is grown by smallholder farmers. They depend on rain-fed aggregation. They don't have access to sprinklers and water tubes and all. So when the temperature goes up and there's lack of rain, it leads to drought, it leads to crop failure, it leads to more usage of groundwater, and then the cycle keeps going on and on and on. So climate change is one of the big reasons for a lot of countries going food insecure. The second biggest reason is, of course, war and conflict. And of the 820 million people which are hungry, 500 million people, and that's 60% of the total hunger population in the world, they are living in conflict regions like South Sudan or DRC Congo or Yemen or Nigeria, places where you have Al Shabaab and Boko Haram, and a lot of people are undergoing displacement because of ethnic violence and conflicts. So war and conflict contributes a lot to hunger. And the third reason is food loss. And this is also quite fascinating. Although we are producing enough food to feed 1.5x of the current population, we waste 33% of the food we grow. So imagine if you have one orange tree in your backyard and it produces 9 oranges, only 6 reach the market and 3 are lost on the way. That's what's happening for the entire amount of food that's being produced in the world. And there are 3 main reasons for that. Our supply chains are inefficient, so we don't package or transport food the right way. That leads to a lot of food loss. Our farmers still use very backward farming techniques, so their yield is not enough, and when whatever they produce, they don't store it properly because they don't have access to godowns and storage houses and cold storages to store it and then transport it. So that leads to a lot of loss. There's a slight point of difference that I want to highlight. So under food loss is also food wastage. So while we are losing 1/3 of the food, the 2/3 that we are getting, we are also wasting a proportion of that. So while the poor countries and the underdeveloped countries, or even the developing countries, they are responsible for food loss, the developed countries are responsible for food wastage. And together, these two factors also contribute to food insecurity. So I want to play a quick video which gives you a quick idea of where are we right now when it comes to hunger.
For decades, the number of hungry people had been declining. This isn't true anymore. Today, achieving the zero hunger goal by 2030 is becoming more challenging. More than 820 million people still do not have enough to eat. Hunger is increasing in many countries where economic growth is lagging, particularly in middle-income countries. Rising unemployment and declining wages and incomes are challenging people's access to nutritious foods and essential services such as healthcare. Income inequality is rising in many of the countries where hunger is on the rise, making it even more difficult for the poor to cope with economic slowdowns. Conflict and climate change are also driving hunger. Unless greater investments and more targeted efforts are made to address these drivers, we will not meet the goal of ending hunger. The Zero Hunger Goal is not simply to eradicate hunger, but to ensure that all people have access to safe, nutritious, and sufficient food, and to end all forms of malnutrition. This year's State of Food Security and Nutrition in the World 2019 report goes beyond hunger. For the first time, it provides estimates of the people who face uncertainties about obtaining food, the moderately food insecure. Today, over 2 billion people do not have regular access to safe, nutritious, and sufficient food, a problem that affects people not only in low and middle income countries, but also in high income countries. The chances of being food insecure are higher for women than men in every continent, with the largest gap in Latin America. Too many children suffer from low birth weight or stunted growth. At the same time, no region is exempt from the epidemic of overweight and obesity. Overweight and obesity have increased in all regions, particularly among school-aged children and adults. But obesity is not the opposite of hunger. They can actually be linked. There are many reasons for this. First, fresh nutritious foods are often more costly and less available than highly processed foods, high in fats and sugars. Another reason is that the stress of living with uncertain access to food and food restrictions can cause physiological changes that increase the risk of overweight and obesity. And lastly, a malnourished child has a higher risk of obesity later in life. There are other repercussions of malnutrition. The economic costs of malnutrition are staggering. Obesity alone could cost $2 trillion annually in lost economic productivity and healthcare costs worldwide. And undernutrition would reduce gross domestic product by up to 11% in Africa and Asia. Our food systems are broken, and unless bolder actions are taken soon, humanity is at grave risk of seeing a continued rise in rates of hunger, obesity, and diet-related chronic diseases. To fix our food system, we must work together. Our actions must be focused on collaboration, stretching across borders from agriculture, food, health and water to education, social protection and economic policies. Countries need to integrate food security and nutrition into broader efforts to reduce poverty and gender inequality. Ending hunger and all forms of malnutrition by 2030 is an immense challenge, but with real political commitment, bolder actions, and the right investments, zero hunger is still achievable.
Right. So we were talking about the drivers, and we discussed about the drivers. Now I'm going to quickly talk about the work we are doing. But before I do that, let me quickly take you back to the very first slide that I presented. So just remember, I highlighted these 2 points: access and utilization, right? And so the work we are doing are addressing these 2 dimensions of food insecurity in sub-Saharan Africa. So what we are doing is we are working in 4 countries in sub-Saharan Africa. That's Ethiopia, Kenya, Tanzania, and Zambia. And we are working with around 160 small-scale food processors in sub-Saharan Africa. Now, why food processors? So our theory of change is that in sub-Saharan Africa, as I showed earlier, there are 250 million people who are hungry and they don't have access to right kind of food. So there are 2 components of hunger in these 4 countries and other countries in sub-Saharan Africa. One, they do not have economic access to food, so they don't have the food which can provide them the right kind of vitamins and minerals, or what I call micronutrients. They don't have economic access. So although those foods are available, but they are very expensive for a bulk of population. So they just don't have the purchasing parity or purchasing power to go and buy those micronutrient rich food items. So that's one, that's related to access. The other is there aren't enough of those food items available. So that's related to quality. So what we are doing in sub-Saharan Africa is that we have identified around 160 food processors. As you see, around 45 food processors in Ethiopia, around 60 in Kenya, 35 in Tanzania, and 20 in Zambia. Now, these food processors, they produce food items which are consumed at population level. And by that, I mean they produce mass scale consumption food items like wheat flour or maize flour or soy milk, fruit juices. But what they don't do is they don't do fortification. And fortification is a process of adding vitamins and minerals in food items. So many countries like the United States of America, they have a mandatory public policy of fortifying every food item that is manufactured in the States. Even in India, there are a lot of food items for which the food processors, they need to fortify the food they manufacture. For example, salt is being fortified with iodine. Similarly, wheat flour and maize flour, they are also added with certain vitamins and minerals. But in sub-Saharan Africa, this wasn't happening till date. TechnoServe got in collaboration with the government of United States, in particular US 8, and six largest food processors in the world. And we formed a platform where we connected these food processing companies with these small scale food processors in these four countries. And we actually taught them how to fortify their food products. Now, what's interesting is that the way we selected these food processor was based on a lot of market research. So these, for example, if we take Ethiopia's case, 45 food processors that we selected in Ethiopia, the total amount of food items they manufacture, which are consumed at population level, they cover 80% of the country's population. So Ethiopia's population is around 50 million people. So these 45 food processors produce enough food that reaches out to 80%, that is 40 million people in Ethiopia. And by same logic, we selected 60 food processors in Kenya, which reach out to 80% of the Kenya's population, and similarly for Tanzania and Zambia. So this is how our theory of change looks like. So TechnoServe worked in these 4 or 5 countries, and we identified the local food processors who we wanted to work with. And then we got into a partnership with world's 6 largest processing companies. So General Mills, Cargill, DSM, most of them are US companies. Hershey's, most of you would know about, and Arden Mills. And we formed something called Partners in Food Solutions. So this is a consortium of world's largest top 6 food processing companies. So TechnoServe collaborated with these 6 companies, and then we connected the 160 food processors with experts from these 6 food processing companies. And those experts extended their technical know-how on how to fortify food products in these 5 sub-Saharan companies. So that's how our model looks like. So we identified food technologists from these top 6 food processing companies. Then we connected them to the food processors in these 5 countries in sub-Saharan Africa, expanded the whole concept of food fortification. And the food products that they manufactured were fortified food products, which reached to 80% of the food insecure population. And because we were helping these food processors improve their processes, we were also connecting smallholder farmers within their supply chains. So on one hand, the smallholder farmers, because of better access to these food processors, they were getting better prices for their crops. So they were getting more money in their pocket. And that was the economic part of the food security. So they had enough money, and then they were also getting access to low-cost fortified food products. So on one hand, they had money in their pockets, and then they had fortified low-cost food products available in their localities. So they could go and buy those food products within their local markets. So that was the whole model. We are still working on this model. We are in our 10th year. So we started in 2010, and we are in our 10th year of working on this model.
Wow, thank you so much. That was incredibly informative, and I learned so much. I want to open it up to the community members. Do you guys have initial thoughts or questions?
I just have a quick question.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just curious. I know a lot of smallholder farmers specifically. The maize that they grow themselves is what they mill into the millie meal, or like the cornmeal that they use for their like staple. Is TechnoServe doing anything to sort of help enrich or fortify any of the like self-milled maize that many smallholder farmers in Africa are. That's how they sort of process.
Right. So, well, thank you for the question, and it's an interesting one. So, we are actually piloting a model called community mills. So, while smallholder farmers, their milling plants, they don't have enough capacity to mill for the entire. I mean, they can mill for a couple of families, but then those mills are not economically sustainable. If they are power-driven mills, if they are mechanical mills, hand-driven mills, then the whole issue of productivity comes into play because they spend a lot of time milling if they are not power driven mills. So I'm talking about power driven mills. And so TechnoServe is setting up a lot of community mills where a lot of farmers come together. They form a farmer cooperative where they pool in their money, and then TechnoServe brings in investors who put in a grant money, and then they set up community mills. The reason we went for community mills instead of individual mills is because in case of corn, there is a very high risk of food contamination. So a lot of maize or corn is often contaminated with something called aflatoxin, which is very poisonous if you handle it incorrectly. And what happens in, especially in Africa, a lot of smallholder farmers, when they dry their maize or corn cobs, they spread it on the ground, right? And it's the same space where they have their chickens running around, they have their dogs running around, and that's where the corn gets contaminated with aflatoxin. And if they process that corn and they take it to the market, it ends up leading to food poisoning, a lot of other reasons. So community mill helps us keep a quality check, and it also helps us mill corn at commercial scale level. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, I was also just asking about like the enrichment portion as well. So where the larger producers that you are supporting, they can fortify with different vitamins and minerals. I was just wondering if there was some sort of plan to translate that into community mills or whatever other programs you have for smallholders.
Right. So, to be honest, fortification is a bit of a sophisticated process, right? And it requires a lot of technical know-how. So, even the local food processors that we are working with, they undergo their training program of 6 to 9 months, where they are under direct observation of these experts from the top six food processing companies that I mentioned. So, it's a bit technical for someone at smallholder level to implement. Also, these vitamins and minerals, most of these countries, sub-Saharan countries, they do not manufacture these fortified recipes, right? So they have to import it from developed nations or developing countries, and it's expensive. So if we factor in the cost benefit at a community level mill, it wouldn't be economically viable. So it is only at a certain threshold of or a quantum of food that you need to process to make it economically viable. So right now we are only fortifying it at large scale or medium scale food processor level. It will take some time for the recipe of the fortified vitamins minerals to come down so that we can do it at community level.
Awesome. Yeah, I hope that was resourceful information. I want to point to anyone else who might have some questions or thoughts.
Guys, I don't know what your political inclinations are, but is there any Obama fan in the house?
Yeah.
All right, because I was working with one particular plant in Ethiopia. It's called Fafa Foods. And during the second term of President Obama, he was on his official tour to Africa, and I had the privilege to meet him because I was working with this food processor. So I actually had a short video of Obama at our food processor. This has been run by an African lady. It's called Fafa Foods, and Obama had a press conference of 3 minutes where he spoke about. And I think that was like the most fascinating experience I have had in the last 8 years of working on this project. Because I mean, once I share these presentations, there's a link of Obama's press conference. It's a 3 minutes conference, and you can see the joy on the faces of those African women standing just next to him, and he's basically talking about and because it was a U.S. aid project, so it makes sense for your president to be there.
Absolutely. And I think in the follow-up, if you want to share that link with us, I think it would be really cool for all of us to see.
Yep.
Any community questions? Anything from you guys? Thoughts? Even feedback?
Yeah, I'm wondering. It's advertised a lot here, maybe it's just my social media, like feed my starving children and other kind of I wouldn't say maybe corporate or type of food supply kind of that's happening on our end to other countries in need. Is there impact? Is the food getting to the areas that really need it? Is it as efficient as I guess it's promoted here? Does that make sense?
Well, impact in itself is always a controversial topic because there's a lot of politics around, to be honest, around impact, right? And especially in this space in food security, the food aid for that matter is highly politically driven, right? So there's a whole politics around food aid in itself. So who gets food and when gets the food and from where gets the food, right? So there's a lot of political vested interest involved in the global supply chains. So I mean, the short answer to your question is yes, there is an impact, but is that the kind of impact we would live with? Probably not. And yeah, I mean, there is a lot to be done. One of the sort of a demotivating news is that the rate at which the hunger was declining in the last couple of decades, it has actually slowed down. So the hunger was declining faster in 1990s and the early 2000s, but from 2010 in the last 10 years, the rate of decline has actually slowed down. So there are less number of people getting out of hunger cycle because of increased number of conflicts and all the world becoming more unipolar again. A lot of nationalist governments coming back to power. I mean, I'm just digressing from the topic, but it does affect all these issues.
I have a question about just individual like accountability. So there's an organization called ReFed, and they're working specifically on eliminating food waste. And with them, they broke down, the levels of accountability and the actors that are in the system that can combat food waste in particular. Obviously, there's things on the institutional level where governments, corporations, and whatnot are responsible. There are people also different types of accountability measures on the individual level, as in your consumption power, how much you do decrease food waste in your particular household. So there are different levels that people are operating in, and a lot of the people in our community are social entrepreneurs, students, even business professionals. So as a point of action, in your background, what would you suggest is a method that we can work towards combating hunger and security, or even some of these other areas of influence that we might have?
Right. I mean, I have not directly worked on food waste because of the very fact that I come from a developing country and I've been working in Sub-Saharan Africa where food waste is not a problem, food loss is a problem. So by virtue of being in a specific geography, I have focused more on food loss. But in specifically in the States, there's this very strong movement going on around food banks, right? So while in the US, there a lot of people, homeless people and other people, they do get food stamps, right? But they still don't get access to the right kind of or the right quality of food, which I mentioned earlier as one of the dimensions of food security. So while they're having enough in their belly, they still are food insecure. And I can share a couple of organizations, and there is one specific one, I forgot its name. It has its food banks in almost every state in the US. So they run food banks, and food banks is one of the most sort of doable and efficient way of managing food waste. And then it's basically collecting and redistributing the food which is still consumable.
Absolutely. Okay. So we have room for one more question, I thought.
Can I ask a question?
Yes, please do.
Okay. One of the things you talked about with food security is this utilization and food quality. And I'm curious about if you fortify a meal that someone's eating the same meal every day, even if it's fortified, does that solve the food quality issue?
When we talk about food fortification, it has to go hand in hand with the concept of food basket, right? So if you're consuming maize flour, it is fortified with vitamins and minerals, say XYZ. and then you're consuming maize porridge the next day, it's been fortified with 1, 2, 3 micronutrients. So if you keep consuming the same kind of food 24/7, all days, all night, then yes, it wouldn't help you. But food fortification needs to go hand in hand with food diversification. So you need to have a more diverse food plate of food items which are food fortified.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, everyone. I apologize, we have to wrap up. I will follow up and send a follow-up email to everyone with a survey and whatnot, and also a way for you guys to stay connected if you want to connect offline. Vikramjeet, if you have a piece of advice that you want to provide to our community of social innovators and entrepreneurs, what would you say on how to combat more of like the hunger and insecurity part?
I think that the most easiest way you can contribute to it is by probably volunteering with one of the food banks which is working in your area, right? Work at their pantry. Even if you're not technically updated with how they address food security, you can help them in distribution, in collection. There are a lot of ways in which you can contribute in streamlining and making the distribution chain more efficient, right? So I mean, and it gives you a taste of what it feels like to work in the space. So yeah, we'll go ahead and volunteer for one of the nearest food banks in your community.
Okay, awesome. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Vikramjeet, for an amazing session, and I hope everyone learned a lot and found it valuable. Thank you, everyone, for joining, and for our viewers, thank you for watching the video session. Just please go onto our website, www.myimpaction.com, to continue the conversation, and we can take it from there. But we will see you next time. Bye.